Five Nights at Freddy's Secret of the Mimic is right around the corner, and with it, a bunch of questions are sure to be answered. Of course, that also means we'll get a whole host of new questions, so in anticipation of that, I thought it would be a good idea to go back and take a look at the story this game is following up, The Mimic from the 6th Tales from the Pizzaplex book. More so than any other game in the series up to this point, this game seems to be uniquely tied to a story in the FNaF canon, given that the trailer names a character from this story, and it seems like we're going to be exploring an area that the entire story is set in. So given that, I reread this story, going over it with a fine-toothed comb to find any little detail that might stand out, and let me tell you, what I found was shocking. If I'm right about my interpretation of events here, our entire understanding of the timeline of these games is going to be completely flipped on its head. Are you ready? Let's get into it. If you've spent any time at all here on YouTube, then you'll be pretty familiar with this story, even if you haven't read it yourself. Edwin creates the Mimic as a way to keep his son David entertained while Edwin's working. This is successful until David tragically dies, after which Edwin, in a fit of grief, attempts to destroy the Mimic. He ends up infusing it with his agony, turning the Mimic into the murderous rage monster we know and love today. It's a tale as old as time. So what's so groundbreaking about all of this? Well, as is often the case in this series, the devil is in the details, or should I say, the Mimic is in the details. So here's a question for you. When does this story take place? Well, early March, we know that because the book tells us. But I mean, what year is it set? I know what you're thinking. This is FNaF. If we ever knew what year something definitively took place in, it would change everything. And that's true. We can't know for 100% certainty, but we can get pretty close. And it's all based on one specific line right here on page 156. It was the early 70s. Now, that line might not mean anything specific yet without further context. I mean, this line isn't referring to when this story is set, it's referring to something that happened in the past. So what I decided to do was to go and dig into every line of this book and pick out anything that we could use to establish a timeline. We actually get a lot of details about the life of the main character, Edwin Murray. We know that he and his wife Fiona were living in a Queen Anne-style mansion that they bought at the same time that Edwin bought his factory. Fiona dies giving birth to David, leaving Edwin to raise him on his own. We know that while Edwin was still in college, he invented a robotic vacuum cleaner which began selling, and it did really well. He was able to start a business right out of college, and this is also around the same time that he and Fiona bought their house. We know that Edwin has had a full sandy brown mustache since his senior year of high school. We know that Edwin had been wanting to be an inventor since he was 8 years old. We know that at the start of this story, David is 4 years old. We know that Edwin has been working for Fazbear, turning costumes into animatronics for the last year and a half. What we don't know is how old Edwin is. Now, there is a line in this book that has given me so many headaches for so long. I'm just gonna read this out to you here. This is on page 148. For nearly all Edwin's 24 years of life, he'd loved building things. So, reading that, I think it's pretty natural to assume that Edwin is 24 years old. I mean, the book seems to be telling us that. If you were writing this story and you wanted to tell the audience that a character was 24 years old, this is how you would do it. Short of just writing out Edwin was 24 years old, which is clunky and awkward. So what's the issue here? Well, like I said, we get a lot of details about Edwin's life, and I don't know, but to me, it really seems like a stretch to say that Edwin is 24 years old at the time of this story. If this were true, then he would have started his business, got married, bought his house and factory 5 years ago when he was like 19 years old, which is certainly possible, but unusual. I mean, wouldn't you want to make a comment about that, bring it up if you were writing this story? Besides, we know that Edwin was at some point a senior in high school, which means he didn't graduate high school early. He went to college, and it doesn't sound like he graduated there early or dropped out or anything. The line about him starting his business right out of school suggests that he graduated like normal. I suppose it is open to interpretation, but I just don't think that this is how you would write that if the character dropped out. So most people graduate high school when they're about 17 to 18 years old. If we assume that Edwin immediately joined college and went for about 4 years, could be more or less, we really don't know, but let's just assume 4 years. He would have graduated when he was around 21, 22. And we know that around the same time, he starts his company, buys his house and factory, yada, yada, yada. And shortly after that, they get pregnant and David is born. So that seems to really fit in with him being around 24 at that time in his life, putting him around 28, 29 during this story, which just feels more correct to me. Otherwise, we have to assume that he only went to like 1 year of college and then dropped out, which is, again, possible, but doesn't seem like that's what this story's trying to tell us. I mean, the line about him being 24 is right after when he learns that he's going to be a father. So it is possible that the writers of this story were intending for that 24 years old thing to be referring to Edwin's age when David was born, or around that time. What I'm saying is, this isn't some huge stretch or anything like that. There's another line about Fiona and Edwin meeting in school and marrying as soon as they graduate, but it's not clear if they're referring to high school or college here. We don't really know anything about Fiona, like if she went to college, so it could go either way. That would certainly help the timeline, but here's the thing. That doesn't really matter too much. Edwin's specific age doesn't really matter too much. What matters is that the book very specifically says 2 things that are unambiguous and very interesting. Edwin started his business 5 years ago, and this was in the early 70s. If you follow the logic here, that puts the time frame of this story sometime in the late 70s. But what's the big deal, I can hear you asking? We know that the year 1979 is shown in the teaser for Secret of the Mimic. That's true, we've suspected this story takes place around that time, but what we haven't really done is ask a very important question in response to that. What does that mean for Fazbear Entertainment? Edwin's job in this story, like I mentioned earlier, is to take Fazbear character costumes and turn them into animatronic robots for the company. And he's been doing this for the past 18 months. So if this story takes place in the late 70s, let's just temporarily say it's 1978, for example, then that means these characters, and Fazbear Entertainment as a company, had to have existed a year and a half before that, say around 76, 77, which is a few years earlier than we had previously thought. I mean, we know that the first Freddy Fazbear's Pizza opened in 1983. That's been well established. But this seems to suggest that the company was around 6 or 7 years before that, and that these characters were around before that too. Here's a list of characters that the book specifically calls out as costumes in Edwin's shop. There are some characters that we don't fully recognize yet, like the dog, the court jester costume, the mushroom. There's a green gator, which might be some kind of precursor to Montgomery Gator. But most importantly, we get the core 4 of Foxy, Chica, Bonnie, and Freddy Fazbear. And that's not just the book describing costumes that we readers can recognize as those characters. They're directly mentioned by name right here on page 185. Freddy is specifically referred to as Freddy Fazbear, not Fredbear. So Freddy Fazbear, as a character, had to have existed around 1978. So all of this is pretty interesting, right? I mean, it makes sense that Freddy Fazbear would predate Fazbear Entertainment. Their name would have had to have come from somewhere, right? But for Freddy to exist this early in the timeline is weird. Like, before Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, what would Freddy's role have been? Fredbear still existed around this time, so were there just 2 bear characters running around next to each other? Seems strange. One thing that is a possibility, Edwin himself never really describes these characters by name. To him, they're just a bright yellow chick and a blue bunny. But later, when Dominic and his team see them, they mention the characters by name. And those guys are actual employees of Fazbear, not just a contractor who was hired in from the outside. Is it possible that these aren't public characters yet? That's why Edwin doesn't know who they are, but Dominic would. The book does establish that these are Fazbear character costumes that are being turned into animatronics, which does suggest that the characters exist, since why else would there be costumes for them? But I don't know. But let's get back to the timeline. Can we get any more specific about when this story takes place? I think we can. Like I said, Edwin started his business in the early 70s, which was around 5 years ago. If we stick with our guess that this story is set in 78, then Edwin started his business in 73. Cool. What next? Well, the events of this story take place over a couple weeks, maybe a couple months at most. We know it takes Edwin 22 days to make the Mimic. I actually had a theory back when the Help Wanted 2 DLC dropped that the numbers 4, 6, 2, 5 were hinting at the release date, April 6, 2025, and that might have lined up with when Edwin creates the Mimic. Not the 2025 part, but the story starts in early March, and the timeline works out that April 6th could be the date when he first powers on the Mimic, but the release date is not April 6th, so never mind. But that's how long I've been working on this video. Anyway, more time passes, David dies, it's very sad. 2 weeks later, Edwin attempts to destroy the Mimic and disappears. The story then cuts to some time later when a team of Fazbear technicians is sent to go through Edwin's factory. One of the guys, Dominic, finds a tape recorder that was left by another team who had been sent there before them. On that recording, the guy mentions that it's a week before Christmas, and later Dominic remarks that the previous team had been sent here a month ago, putting these events in January. If the first half of this story takes place in the spring of 78, then this part of the story takes place in January 1979, the same year we see in The Secret of the Mimic teaser. Could it be that in this game, we're going to be playing as Dominic and his team, Harry and Glenn? Is what I would have said before the full trailer dropped. In this new trailer, whoever we're playing as seems to have a lot more information about what's going on in the factory. Andy Field tells us about the Mimic, and our job seems to be specifically to bring the Mimic in. So this would seem to be a little bit later on than in the book, where Fazbear doesn't know really much about anything of the Mimic. So maybe the events of the book happen earlier than we initially thought. That said, in the trailer, we do see a scene on the roof where it appears to be snowing. So that fits in with it being January. Just thought that was neat. Now, all of that is interesting enough on its own, and getting a handle on when this story is set is cool and all, but that doesn't really change all that much about the broader timeline. Or does it? Because this story isn't the last we hear of Edwin Murray. It's also not the first we hear of him, because there's another story that came out before this one that's set after this. The Storyteller from the 5th Tales from the Pizzaplex book. In this story, Edwin is much older and he's working at the Mega Pizzaplex. We don't need to get into too much detail about this story, but the important thing is that Edwin's age is brought up again. This time, it's pretty unambiguous. The book says he's 64, and there's no other way to interpret that. But hang on, I just mentioned that this story is set in the Pizzaplex. But if the Mimic is set in 1978, and this story takes place 36 years later, then that would mean that it's set in the year 2014. This, my friends, is where things get really interesting. If these stories are to be taken seriously within the continuity of the games, and my interpretation of these details is correct, that would mean that the Pizzaplex existed as early as 2014. And it doesn't sound like the Pizzaplex is brand new or anything. It's open, it's functional, it's popular. I don't know that there's any way to tell exactly how long the Pizzaplex has been open, but I think we have to assume at least a year, right? So it could have been opened in like 2013 or something, or maybe even earlier, which is a huge upheaval in our understanding of the timeline. I mean, we assume that FNaF 6 takes place in 2023, and Help Wanted has things like Helpy and the Scrap Baby plushies, suggesting that either the events of FNaF 6 or the game Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator, which is mentioned as a game in the books, have already happened. And it's in the Curse of Dreadbear DLC that we see the Pizzaplex under construction. Now that could just be symbolic, right? The Pizzaplex, as in Security Breach, is coming soon. It's under construction because the game, Security Breach, is being designed. It's not telling us that at this time, in the canon of these games, that the Pizzaplex is currently being built. But who knows? Anyway, the last thing that I want to point out here is that Edwin's age in the Mimic could very well be 24. And if so, that does change the timeline a little bit. If he's 24 in 1978, then he'd be 64 and the Storyteller would be set in 2018, which is a little later in the timeline, but not by much. It's still way earlier than any of us would have thought. There are a lot of reasons to believe that the events of Security Breach and Ruin happened way later than what the books are presenting. Like the Pizzaplex could have existed, and then a lot of stuff happens, and then Security Breach happens. We know that it goes through a bunch of renovations, and the way the Pizzaplex is described in the book is way different than we see in the game, so that could explain that. Anyway, I'm gonna end this video here. The implications of this could be an entire other video on its own, and I don't want this one to go on too long. There are also a lot more details that I didn't get into, like the stories Nexie and Tiger Rock are pretty tied in with these two, as are all of the epilogues, so there's a bunch of details in those that are worth looking into. Like the question of why nobody in the epilogues uses a cell phone, or why can the Mimic speak in the epilogues when it couldn't in the story The Mimic. But the details in those other books could, again, be separate videos that I'll probably make sometime in the future. So subscribe to get ready for that, and until then, I'm Mr. Red. And remember, keep watching.